I think after, a century of China sort of biding its time and being relatively weak, and in the last 30 years relatively focused on its own development, it now has begun to be a little bit more forward and to try and restore itself to what it historically has conceived of its rather prominent place in the world, an ascendant place, particularly in the world that it once knew, which was Asia. So I think there is this memory of almost imperial greatness that has lingered, and now at last that China has gained sufficient wealth and power and military force, it's beginning to act out in a way that we're not very familiar with in the West. China, particularly in maritime sort of area of the South China Sea and the East China Sea, has been pushing the boundaries of what it claims both territorially and in terms of influence ever farther forward. And its claims, particularly in the South China Sea, which in essence include the whole South China Sea, from South China to Indonesia, up the Malaysia coast, the Vietnamese coast, then down the Philippine, Brunei coast. It's pretty audacious. And so the pivot to Asia that the United States announced a couple of years ago is in response to that, basically to claim that this is nobody's territory. It's of maritime significance for every nation which trades and has shipping. The Chinese have built islands, and once built, they've used them to declare sovereign territory and used it to claim, special economic zones and territorial waters. And many of these have overlap with other countries of the region which are weaker and unable to really do much about it, particularly the Philippines and Vietnam. So I think the U.S. feels is being entreated by these countries to take a more forceful position. It is true that China is beset by an extraordinary number of quite severe domestic problems, from environment to gaps between wealthy and poor, to regional problems, massive corruption within the party, a whole political system that is in a state of flux, and now relations with their neighbors that are in a somewhat more problematic vein. So I think there are an awful lot of uncertainties for China. We look at it and often we think they're doing quite nicely and somewhat invincible. But if you look behind the screen and you kind of X-ray it, sort of the societal fracture points, you see that there are a tremendous number of things that are causing their leaders to be very worried. I think the current president and party general secretary, Xi Jinping, is unlike his two predecessors who ruled more or less by consensus. China had tired of its big leader culture of Mao and even Deng Xiaoping. But now we find with Xi Jinping a kind of return to that sort of leadership, centralizing power in his hand, being much more forceful, and also being much more autocratic, much less tolerant of civil society, dissenting views, academic freedom, religious freedom, all of these kind of conventional forms of free expression. And in this sense, he, I think, is something of a throwback, and quite surprising to a lot of people, because the presumption was that China would sort of slowly and ineluctably develop to become more open. And now the opposite is happening. The presumption ever since the reform movement in China began, it was really after Mao Zedong died in 1976, was that slowly China would become more open, more democratic, more, if we just kept up the trade, economic relations, cultural exchange, academic exchange, civil society interaction. And that was a rather nice dream, but I think in retrospect something of a naive one. And now I think what we see is that China, by inclination, whether in its Confucian guise or its Leninist guise, is not particularly democratically inclined. Moreover, I think the United States of late has been an increasingly uninspiring example of democracy, particularly the federal government. And so that combination, I think, has stilled some of the ardor in many countries, but particularly in China, to go that route. And so it's become more appealing to Chinese to think that they might have developed their own kind of authoritarian capitalist model.